Although providing law enforcement a false confession to a crime one did not commit seems implausible, it happens more often than people think. According to the Innocence Project, approximately 27% of DNA-exonerated cases involve a false confession. Today I would like to share with you what research has taught us about false confessions and how coercive interrogation tactics often used by law enforcement may contribute to this phenomenon. So first, let's start by differentiating between two different types of false confessions, one being coerced internalized and the second being coerced compliant. Basically, a coerced internalized false confession is one in which the interrogation process leads the suspect to form a false memory of committing the crime, and the suspect ends up genuinely believing they committed the crime in question. Conversely, a coerced compliant false confession is one in which the interrogation process leads the suspect to provide a false confession because they are led to feel as though the consequences of continuing to deny their involvement in the crime is actually worse than providing a false confession. So here, they don't actually believe they committed the crime in question when providing the confession. As explained by Zhu and colleagues in 2010, sometimes false memories are formed due to the misinformation effect. So this is when a person's recollection of an event is changed after being provided misinformation about an event the individual either witnessed or experienced. Some ways in which this happens is either the person updates a previously held memory with the new incorrect information, or the new incorrect information is mixed with the previously held memory. So, if a suspect is provided information about the crime by law enforcement during the interrogation, and the suspect mixes up this information with an originally held memory of their alibi, let's say, it may come out later during the interrogation and appear as an inconsistency in their story, or as if they were actually involved with the crime. As stated in Mazzoni, Loftus, and Kirsch in 2001, it's theorized that there is a three-step process to internalizing a false memory. The first is to make a given event be perceived as plausible. Second, make the subject believe the event is likely to have happened to him or her. And third, the person is provided assistance in interpreting their thoughts about the misinformation as actual memories. This can lead to an inability to decide if the memory is actually true or simply a byproduct of suggestions received from law enforcement during the interrogation process. This is further complicated by a lengthy interrogation that may span several hours or even days. Law enforcement may contribute to this phenomenon by utilizing two common interrogation techniques. The first being suggesting a scenario, and the second presenting evidence. These tactics involve interrogators providing a scenario of how the suspect may have been involved in the crime and how they committed it, and or presenting evidence of the crime that the suspect may not have previously known. If during the interrogation process the suspect is unable to determine if the suggested scenario or evidence disclosed to them during the process was an actual memory or a byproduct of the process, this can lead to a formation of false memory of committing the crime. So in other words, if the suggestibility of the interrogation leads the suspect to believe that the accusations could have reasonably happened the way the interrogators say they did, the suspect can acquire an internalized acceptance that because the event could have occurred, it must have. This is especially true if the suspect is unable to differentiate if the memory is true or false, and therefore reconstruct their memory to conform to the new information being provided by the investigator. In one study conducted by Shaw and Porter, the researchers successfully implanted a full episodic false memory of committing a crime in their test subjects. Specifically, of those participants involved in a criminally relevant false memory, 70% of them internalize a false memory of their participation in the event. They also found that of those participants involved in a false memory not involving a criminal act, 77% of them internalize the false memory. So this tells us that according to this study, the participants were, statistically speaking anyway, just as likely to internalize a false memory of committing a crime as they were to internalizing a false memory that did not involve engaging in a criminal activity. So, a suspect saying, "It must have happened," or "I must have done it," may possibly be a red flag that the confession is an internalized false confession. Before discussing coerced compliant false confessions, it should be noted that according to the training manual of the most popular interrogation model utilized by law enforcement, also known as the Reed technique, authored by Bao and colleagues in 2013, the ultimate goal of an interrogation is a confession. Now, for coerced compliant false confessions, remember, this is when a suspect does not internalize a false memory of committing a crime, but rather this occurs when he or she responds to the external pressures of interrogators and subsequently provides a false confession in order to alleviate said pressures and perceived consequences of maintaining their innocence. In some situations, interrogators may coerce the suspect to believe that because there is evidence stacked against them, whether such statements are factual or not, or that there is no way a jury will believe their alibi, providing a confession will be the best thing in order to avoid harsh punishments. In such circumstances, suspects may find themselves being pressured into choosing between the lesser of two evils, either maintaining their innocence and risking harsher punishment if they are arrested with the hopes of exoneration with the trial, or giving in and providing a confession, even if it's false, in the hopes of leniency in their sentencing. Expected utility theory, as discussed in Yang, Madsen, and Guile in 2014, helps us to understand how both the probability and desirability of perceived consequences help us when deciding between two courses of action. In this case, between continuing to maintain innocence or providing a false confession. This theory explains that when deciding which route to take, short-term consequences are given more weight. Conversely, distal consequences are given less weight because of the uncertainty related to events perceived to happen in the distant future. In a situation where a suspect must decide between maintaining innocence or providing a false confession, the immediate consequences of maintaining one's innocence includes a prolonged interrogation, distressing emotional state, and a lack of sleep. Sometimes interrogations have lasted upwards of 16 hours straight, and some have been documented to span over the course of days at a time. Conversely, the immediate consequences of providing a false confession include being released from the interrogation room, getting some sleep, and being able to make a phone call. On the other hand, the distal consequences of maintaining one's innocence is the possibility of exculpation. Conversely, the distal consequences of providing a false confession include conviction, incarceration, and possibly facing the death penalty. Such distal consequences tend to be perceived as distant and therefore less possible than the more immediate consequences as just listed. Lastly, I will go over the most common interrogation tactics suggested when using the Reed technique that are the most relevant to the topic at hand. Generally, there are two main categories: maximization and minimization. With maximization techniques, the goal is to obtain a confession via intimidation. Conversely, with minimization techniques, the goal is to obtain a confession by providing a false sense of security in the suspect. One specific maximization technique is disclosure of evidence. This is where the interrogator discloses evidence to the suspect. However, the information provided to the suspect does not necessarily have to be truthful or factual. An example of this would be the interrogator telling the suspect that an eyewitness placed them at the scene of the crime, or that the victim has identified them as a perpetrator. Yet another ploy is to provide untruthful information regarding polygraph results or admissibility of polygraphs. Here, the investigator will blatantly fabricate the results, indicating the test suggests deception on the part of the suspect and/or exaggerating the admissibility of polygraph results. Another maximization technique is when the interrogator will gauge the emotional state of the suspect and conduct the interrogation accordingly. In other words, the interrogator will exploit the anxiety of the interrogation to their advantage by interrogating for hours on end and having the suspect confined to a small, windowless room in order to deplete the physical, emotional, and cognitive resources the suspect may have that may prevent them from providing a confession. Here, the suspect must metaphorically choose between fight or flight. Yet another maximization technique often used is referred to as situational futility. This is where the suspect is made to feel trapped and that proclaiming their innocence is futile. In such situations, the suspect's goal shifts from proclaiming their innocence to getting leniency. Such a tactic may include an interrogator telling the suspect that if they don't provide a confession, they can potentially receive the death penalty should the jury find them guilty. This, coupled with the presentation of false evidence, can be extremely effective in making the suspect feel coerced into providing a false confession. The final maximization technique that I'll discuss is suggesting a scenario. So this is where the interrogator provides his or her version of events. A byproduct of this tactic is that the suspect is fed information only the perpetrator and law enforcement would know. Such information is sometimes referred to as misleading specialized knowledge. Examples of misleading specialized knowledge may include photos of the crime scene, the weapon that was used, placement of objects throughout the crime scene, or even the location of wounds on a victim. Once a suspect is aware of the misleading specialized knowledge, it is incorporated into a subsequent false confession. It may be easy for the trier of fact to assume that only the suspect would have such knowledge of the crime, so therefore he or she must be guilty. The trier of fact may not even see the entire interrogation, but only the end portion where the suspect provides the false confession, integrating various pieces of misleading specialized knowledge. And now for a discussion on minimization techniques. The most relevant tactic in this category is minimization of the offense. So here, the interrogator will reduce the moral or legal significance in order to eliminate any emotional guilt that may be preventing the suspect from confessing to the crime. So such statements may include, I know you didn't mean to do it, or it could have happened to anyone. According to the creators of the Reed technique, only a guilty person would find comfort in such a statement, ergo, further implicating the suspect's involvement in the mind of the interrogator. So this concludes my presentation on false confessions and coercive interrogation tactics. I want to thank you for your time and your participation.